Hello, everyone. Welcome particularly to Professor Scott Slovic at the talk organized by the UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies, Department of English. We should begin by acknowledging that we have literally roused him out of his warm sleep at 5:30 a.m. his local time, so that it fits in with what we are doing here at 7 p.m. in India. Professor Scott Slovic is a person whose name is synonymous with the study of the literature and the environment. As the founding president of the Association for the Study of Literature and the Environment, he edited the first major journal in the field, ISLE, or Interdisciplinary Studies in Literature and the Environment, for a very long time. He has a couple of monographs also to do with environmental writing, Going Away to Think, Engagement Retreat, and Eco-Critical Responsibility, and Seeking Awareness in American Nature Writing. He edits 2 book series for Routledge, and he has in the most recent past edited the Bloomsbury Handbook to the Medical and Environmental Humanities and Nature and Literary Studies from Cambridge, the second from Cambridge, the first from Bloomsbury. This talk has been thought of as initiating for the chair that we host at the Department of English, as initiating the theme of ecological vulnerability or vulnerability in the environment. And by consensus, unanimously arrived at, I might add, Scott was the person of choice. So as the chair's ambit is quite large, looking at multiple kinds of vulnerability, as the first of the thematic subjects, we had Professor Vinod Pawala speaking on community radio and media vulnerabilities when the chair was inaugurated formally on 7th November. This is the second talk in that series. And we expect that Scott's talk will set in motion several ideas, possible research topics and domains, but also provide, and it's a difficult balance to achieve, we understand that, for people who are interested in knowing what this area of ecological and environmental vulnerability is, as a way to start thinking about it. So I also take this opportunity to welcome all our guests this evening, members of the UNESCO Chair team. That would be Professor Anna Kurian, my colleague, Meenakshi Srihari, and Atul Nair, who are also doing a bit of the logistics for this. For those of you who might worry that we will lose connection, we are recording the talk and it will be placed on the chair's website eventually after any editing that might be required. So without any further delay, over to Scott, and welcome one and all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pramod, and thanks to all of you for attending this talk. And it's my honor to participate in this series of lectures under the auspices of the new UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies at Hyderabad University. As you heard, I'm speaking to you from the other side of the planet, where it's quite early in the morning. I've been up since around 4:30, making sure that I'm awake and ready to present to you over in India in the evening. I wonder if someone could begin sharing my slides so that I can jump right into my talk. I will try to speak for approximately 40 minutes and reserve 15 or 20 minutes for Q&A and conversation. Great, thank you. And let's see, I wonder if we could put it in the present mode so the slide is a little bit larger. Perfect. Great, thank you. I will jump right into this. So obviously, my scope in this talk is to focus on the environment or ecological vulnerability and in particular to connect this form of vulnerability to the literary imagination, which might be broadened to the arts more generally. And the opening image on the screen is on this first slide is of a longtime friend and colleague of mine named Robert Michael Pyle, a very prominent American environmental writer who, when I was visiting him and interviewing him for a project many years ago, took me a short distance from his home to show me where logging operations were happening. This is a clear-cut site, and you can just see him with his hands at his side, feeling a sense of disturbance and frustration and concern at this devastation of the nearby landscape, which is something that is happening in many parts of the world, visibly or invisibly. And many of us, not only artists, feel this sense of unsettlement at the idea of what our civilization is doing to the planet, and perhaps what it implies for the future of our own species. And so writers and artists have sought to come up with certain strategies, certain techniques. Sometimes they've done this intuitively, not through any particularly conscious planning of techniques, but intuitively they've sensed how they might communicate ideas about the vulnerability of the planet in such a way that this communication will be poignant for audiences and meaningful for audiences. Next slide. So just to give you an overview of my thinking about this subject, I'd like to present to you this short abstract. The human mind has limited ability to embrace the meaning of ecosystemic vulnerability, but immense capacity to appreciate the frailty of individual non-human organisms, which exhibit precarity akin to our own. Even inhumanly strong and durable natural beings, such as whales, primates, and redwood trees, are legible to us as fellow quote-unquote vulnerables, individual, mortal, and representative of species susceptible to extinction. Such psychological tendencies as speculative empathy, empathetic self-projection, and self-erasure, and metaphorical emulation are aspects of what social scientists and literary scholars have dubbed the arithmetic of compassion. So key ideas to keep in mind in communicating vulnerability through literature and art are the power of singularity, focusing on the individual, even when attempting to convey the vulnerability of a large group, such as a species itself. The importance of identifying with the victim, seeing a connection between ourselves and any victim that is being portrayed. The victim's innocence or lack of control over the situation resulting in harm or potential harm. This idea of not being the cause oneself, but actually being a kind of innocent victim is particularly powerful in the psychological literature, in evoking a reader or a viewer's sense of concern for this victim. And also the direness of the potential harm. There's something about mortality, which would include extinction of a larger group, that is particularly salient and motivational for an audience member. Next slide. So I began thinking about environmental destruction, which is the long-time focus of my own work by way of literature and art. I began thinking of this in terms of precarity when I started reading Professor Nayar's work, 6 or 7 years ago, particularly his book that is not focused strictly on environmental destruction, but rather on the human implications of environmental contamination. That is his 2017 book, Bhopal's ecological Gothic, Disaster, Precarity, and the Biopolitical Uncanny, in which Professor Nayar talks about literary and cultural studies embodying an ethical turn, bringing a moral dimension into the human rights aspects of undemocratic exposure of populations to contamination, torture, and the destruction of the environment where humans are trying to inhabit. And his book in particular focuses on rhetorical and discursive strategies, basically the aspects of artistic expression that literary scholars and scholars in related fields might analyze in order to determine the techniques employed by these writers in order to convey precarity in the context of disaster, which is very much like what I will try to do very quickly in today's presentation. Next slide. Next slide. A few years later, the picture got turned for some reason. A few years later, Professor Nayar expanded the scope of his first book on precarity to the environmental context in his book, Eco-Precarity, Vulnerable Lives in Literature and Culture from 2019, in which he says that the focus of his project is the contingent nature of the earth in order for us to sense the beauty, fragility, and singularity of the planet we inhabit, which we stand to lose if we do not take care of our only home. And this is very much my own sensibility in much of my work, being quite aware of the contingent nature of many things that we may be complacent about, we may take for granted on this planet. Individual organisms, entire species, bioregions, natural processes. All of it is contingent and vulnerable. And bringing the concept of vulnerability or precarity to the environmental context, I think, helps us to recognize the fragility and contingency of things that we may believe are permanent and stable. Next slide. And back to the Bhopal's ecological Gothic project, I think the passage at the very end of the book where he's commenting on a really poignant visual representation of the Bhopal disaster in this photograph by Raghu Rai titled Burial of an Unknown Child. We see the jarring use of visual and narrative rhetoric, the juxtaposition of the hand gently brushing dirt off the face of a child who has been viciously killed through the poison of the Union Carbide spill and disaster, that the unlikely and incompatible juxtaposition of the gentleness and the violence of the child's death has a very powerful effect on viewers, which Professor Nayar explains here. And I'll try to walk through some examples of environmental vulnerability through literature that offer similar strategies, not necessarily the dissonance shown in this photograph, but other kinds of discursive strategies. Next slide. So for years, I've been working with my father, the psychologist Paul Slovic, to understand what we call the arithmetic of compassion. First, in a 2015 book called Numbers and Nerves, Information, Emotion, and Meaning in a World of Data, which offers research articles on the psychology of compassion, and then extensive discussion of communication strategies in order to help us to feel something in the context of threat and vulnerability in relation to humanitarian and environmental challenges. And then we expanded the ideas from this book that same year, 2015, to create a website titled Arithmetic of Compassion, and the URL is www.arithmeticofcompassion.org. Next slide. And the website includes overviews of the key concepts from psychology and the environmental humanities. Next slide. The psychological ideas that I won't go into huge depth on during this talk include psychic numbing, the fact that the human mind, even the minds of highly numerate people, people who can calculate easily, all of our minds are quickly overwhelmed in an emotional sense by numbers larger than one, the number one. And this leads to tragic insensitivity to large-scale phenomena. We are intensely focused as human beings on individual phenomena, on singularities. And then we also, in the book and on the website, talk about pseudo-inefficacy, our tendency not to care about crises if we feel we can't help anyone, especially if these crises are large scale, or if they're invisible, far away, or in other ways, we just feel we will not be effective in responding. Also, the prominence effect, the idea that we are quickly distracted if we're faced by multiple choices in relation to a crisis, if there are, if what an action might lead us away from something else that we care about, that we value. Also, it's very easy to build trust in expert commentary, in scientific information. It's very difficult to build trust and very easy to puncture or undermine that trust. So that all we have to do is have someone create doubt about the veracity of a threat of some kind or a vulnerability, and we're likely to turn away from it because we don't believe the journalists or the technical experts who are telling us that this is something we should be concerned about. The anesthesia of destruction, the fact that we are not only numbed by large numbers, but we're often numbed by any kind of technical information or jargon describing a phenomenon that might lead us to be concerned. So there's an anesthetic effect of certain types of discourse. Vandana Shiva, the activist and writer from New Delhi, particularly tried to explain that to me when I interviewed her for the Numbers and Nerves project. And also the trans-scalar imaginary, the use of certain types of literature and art to help us to think beyond the individual, to move across scales from the one to the many, the individual to the collective. And the American photographer and filmmaker Chris Jordan is particularly well known for his efforts to help audiences of his work move across scales and develop this trans-scalar imaginary capacity. And a discussion with him is also in the Numbers and Nerves project. Next slide. So very briefly, how should we value the saving of human lives or other phenomena, including environmental phenomena that we believe to be important? You would think in a rational sense that one life or one habitat, environmental habitat, should be worth 1 unit of value, and 2 lives should be worth 2 units of value, and so forth. There should be a linear upward trajectory, or perhaps in a rational sense, the more lives or the more habitats or the larger an expanse of ocean at risk, the more important the value should be. There should be an exponential increase because of the potential implications of vast destruction, such as critical colony collapse in the case of honeybees or other pollinators. This is the rational, logical way that we should be looking at loss and value. Next slide. In reality, though, as I suggested earlier when I mentioned psychic numbing, the human mind begins to lose attention, to lose compassion already when we move from the number 1 to the number 2, there's a dip in value, a diminishment. And so that by the time we start talking about 10 or 100 or 1,000 lives, each individual life is of minimal importance compared to the other lives. So there is not this upward curve. Next slide. And in fact, if you look at the graph here on the right, often there's a decline. This is what the empirical psychological research shows. There's often a collapse of compassion when we start talking about larger scale phenomena, so that viewers or audiences receiving the information become less interested the more lives that are involved in a particular situation, the more lives that are at risk, whether they're human lives or other kinds of lives. Next slide. So how do we overcome these intrinsic, very worrisome psychological tendencies of human beings? Well, one of the things that we've discovered is that communicating multidimensionally, not just in a single way, but using a variety of techniques intertwined with each other, images, stories, or narratives, personalized faces, actually bringing to life the identities of individual characters, and then by helping audiences understand the psychological processes that are going on in their own minds as they receive this information, we might begin to make a dent in the numbness that would otherwise occur. We might begin to puncture that numbness. Next slide. So I think I have to move a little bit more quickly. On the website, the Arithmetic of Compassion website, we have numerous essays, interviews, and reviews highlighting the relevance of psychological and environmental humanities ideas to both long-term crises and acute issues of the day. Next slide. For instance, in this past year, we worked with an Ethiopian woman who currently lives in Switzerland and wrote a testimony statement about vulnerable human beings in her native territory of Tigray in Ethiopia. And she wrote particularly about her feeling of um, um, helplessness as she cares about her family members back in this embattled region, but is living far away and unable to do anything to help them. So this is a story, a testimony about vulnerable human beings that very powerfully and eloquently writes about her situation as someone who is aware of a crisis and unable to do anything about it. Next slide. This appeared on the website back in February, with a little explanation of secondhand testimony, the testimony of a person not directly involved in a crisis, but someone who witnessed it and was aware of it and is attempting to convey her plight as a person who's concerned and unable to act. Next slide. Also, another example from the website is a short story written by a colleague in Kerala, a work of fiction focusing on a girl in India attempting to calculate the statistics related to disabled people in her village who find their lives very difficult. And she expresses the idea that numbers are inadequate to capture the meaning of these people's lives. It's a critique of statistics and a suggestion that story is a particularly potent way of representing the conditions and the experiences of certain people that we might not otherwise understand. Next slide. So these are examples of human efforts to convey human vulnerability. So Amy Dillard is a writer that I've been writing about quite a bit lately. We're on the verge of the 50th anniversary of the publication of her most famous book, which is called Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. It's an environmental exploration of her immediate neighborhood many years ago. But Dillard is a fascinating subject because of the way she experiments with compassion in a variety of ways in her works. So this is not about vulnerability per se, but in her memoir published in 1987 called An American Childhood, she uses strategies of empathetic self-projection. She imagines herself in the condition of other characters um, in a fascinating way. For instance, when telling the story of a time when she and some other children were pelting automobiles with snowballs, and a man stopped his car in the middle of the street and began chasing the children until he finally caught them and grabbed them. At the culmination of the narrative, she imagines what she might have done if she had been this man catching children who were doing something inappropriate and destructive. Would she have um, fried the children in boiling oil, or cut them to pieces, or stake them to an anthill? She imagines empathetically how she might have behaved if she were this man. And so what she's doing here is she's empathizing not with herself as a child, but with the man who chased after her and projecting herself into his existence. And this is one of the things that a literary artist does, even when working in the genre of nonfiction, which is what this memoir is. Next slide. One of Dillard's most famous examples of self-projection is her essay from the 1982 book, Teaching a Stone to Talk, the essay called Living Like Weasels, where she tries to imagine herself being in the mind of this small predator, which is holding a mouse or a rat in this particular picture. Um, the essay is called Living Like Weasels, and what she does is present a kind of extra human, beyond human, empathetic self-projection. This is not an essay specifically about the vulnerability of the weasel, but it's a fascinating example of projecting the human self into the non-human. And Dillard is a master at this type of action. Next slide. Also, Annie Dillard suggests the ability to empathize deeply with the other seems to require a form of self-erasure, not just projecting the self, but having the self disappear or evaporate, and so that the viewing self becomes the other. She uses the phrase here in the chapter Stalking from her famous book Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, the phrase, I am a tissue of senses. I am nothing solid. I am just my senses, transparent, translucent, and available to perceive otherness. Next slide. Wholly the Firm is a book of Dillard's where she's particularly interested in understanding vulnerability. At the beginning of the book, she writes about a small child who has been badly disfigured, badly hurt in an airplane accident when the jet fuel exploded, and the girl is gruesomely burned, terribly burned. And she asks herself, why did this girl named Julie suffer such an injury? How could something so cruel happen in such a beautiful world? And to get a feel for what this means, Dillard contemplates a moth, a small insect, burning in candle wax. And she becomes a kind of Emersonian, as in Ralph Waldo Emerson, transparent eyeball, as he describes himself in his famous essay, Nature, where he becomes what Dillard later calls a tissue of the senses, transparent and sensitive to all that is outside of him. So first, Dillard in this book, early in the book, describes a moth flying into the flame of a candle, and Dillard is fascinated by this experience of the moth and tries to imagine what it might mean. And then later, next slide, she writes about translucency and trying to appreciate the world's translucency as she becomes the world she perceives. In order for the world to be translucent, to allow light to cross through it, the self must also be translucent, or we must erase the solid self and become a tissue of the senses. So in this particular passage, which I won't read, she becomes an Emersonian transparent eyeball, not a perceiver of the world, but a being convergent with all other beings. You see at the very end of this passage, she says, I am moth, I am prayer, and I can hardly see. I just am these beings. I'm not outside of them, seeing them or perceiving them. Next slide. Dillard's empathy often does not become a problem-solving compassion. As she experiments with empathy, it's not as if she always wants to jump in and solve some sort of crisis, to protect or save or rescue something or someone who's vulnerable. She's simply a student of compassion. She will often enact these psychological processes of projection or dissolution and then study these processes, such as when she watches an acrobatic pilot flying his small airplane in elaborate ways, and she imagines him as an artist, and she studies the relationship between her artistry and his piloting of an airplane. Next slide. And let's just skip this slide. It's still about this metaphorical emulation of a pilot, but I don't want to go into detail because my time is limited. So how do we grasp and communicate vulnerability of non-human phenomena such as the environment or specific elements within the environment? Next slide. Well, as I mentioned earlier in my talk, some of the key ideas to keep in mind when conveying the vulnerability of non-human phenomena are the power of singularity, even when conveying vulnerability of a large group, the importance of identifying with the victim. Often this requires personification of the victim, even when the victim is not human. And this means the use of anthropomorphism, giving the non-human character or being human attributes. Often when we read environmental writing, we view this as a mistake, as a shortcoming of imagination. But what we've come to realize in the field of ecological literary studies is that enabling readers to identify with a non-human character allows for a sense of identification that makes that literary representation poignant or meaningful. The victim's innocence or lack of control over the situation resulting in harm or potential harm is very important, and the direness of the potential harm. Next slide. So many of these elements exist in an article by a Canadian doctoral student from McGill University named Amy Donovan, who published a fascinating article. I don't know why the pictures are being shifted sideways, but her article is titled Raw, Dense, and Loud, and it appeared in the 2022 book called Cold Water Oil, subtitle Offshore Petroleum Cultures. It's a brand new book that appeared in the Routledge Environmental Humanities series that I co-edit. And this article by Amy Donovan is a fascinating representation of the vulnerability of the northern right whale as a result of petroleum prospecting in the Arctic seas. Next slide. And Donovan's article uses multidimensional communication. I mentioned earlier that one way of breaking through the insensitivity of readers to particular information that that a writer is trying to convey regarding an environmental problem or crisis is to use multidimensional strategies. This article by Donovan uses fictional speculative narrative, the language and the information from neuroscience, the way whales think about the world, cetological science, whale studies and about the lives of whales, literary criticism, analyzing poetry and fiction about whales, and information from the field of petroleum engineering in separate sections of the essay in order to draw readers into the experience of whales in the northern seas. Next slide. And the essay opens, though, the very first passage in the essay, with a third-person narrative representing the perspective of an individual young whale thinking about her mother becoming entangled in the ropes and gears of petroleum prospectors as they put their equipment into the ocean, and then the mother becoming entangled, drowning, and the young whale mourning. It's highly personified. And this is the way Donovan begins this essay, talking about the 4-year-old young whale, the dangling fronds, which are not kelp fronds, they're not plants, such as the whales are normally accustomed to in the natural oceans, but something heavy and dense of the hardened tentacles, the machinery dangling in the water. It wrenches and bobs. Her mother seems to fit it, but the fronds are coarse and they grip. Perhaps, and Donovan is writing speculatively. She's not writing about an actual whale. She cannot know what the whale is actually thinking, but she can speculate. Perhaps the 4-year-old whale even now bears a memory of ropes, a fear that is generations deep. Perhaps she watches when her mother takes her final breath. Perhaps her mother tells her she will not have the strength to surface again. Somehow, in some non-human way, the young whale mourns. So the perhaps reminds us that this is speculative, even fictional. And yet the young whale is so personified, seems so much like a human character, that we're able to suspend our disbelief and imagine the experience of the young whale suffering from the effects of offshore petroleum exploration. Next slide. So when I interviewed Donovan for the Arithmetic of Compassion website, she writes in a really fascinating way about her efforts as a creative writer and a scholar, trying to find the right language in order to convey what we could call environmental vulnerability. She aims for what she calls a tangible crackle, lively, material, interactive, not pretending to aim for any sort of formal, stiff objectivity. She says, language can do a great deal that we often do not ask it to do, especially in academic work, suggesting that we might all attempt to use certain techniques that seem unavailable to us in our writing in order to convey that which seems almost beyond communication, such as the experience of whales in an ocean that has become hostile to them. To convey the vulnerability of whales, you might say, we have to reach beyond language as usual. Next slide. A very comparable example of representing environmental vulnerability, I would say, is Mary Beth Holloman's 2018 poem, which appeared in the journal Isle that I edited for many years. The poem is called How to Grieve a Glacier. It's very short, so I can just quickly read it to you. She begins the poem, "It's not something you can hold in your arms. You can't rock with its image in a blanket and keen away the nearing pain. The white face is distant and cold, unrelenting in its forward grind to the sea, stalwart even as it thins, crumbles, pulls back into history and oblivion." There you see a picture actually of the famous Mendenhall Glacier in Alaska, where Holloman lives, which is a radically diminishing glacier, a body of permanent ice, which is rapidly shrinking due to global warming. This is a problem all around the earth. Holloman, as an Alaskan writer, is writing about glaciers in her part of the world. The poem personifies the glacier, imagining how difficult it would be to hug the disappearing ice mass in a blanket. You might also notice the use of singularity. It's one, she writes about one glacier, not glaciers in general. She identifies the face of the glacier and refers to its mortality, its thinning and crumbling and pulling back into oblivion, which is a kind of mortality. So she's using mortality salience. She's helping readers to identify with the face of the glacier, as if the glacier had a human-like face. And she's also writing about, as I said, one glacier, because we can focus our minds on a single thing more than we can on multiple glaciers or on glaciers in general. Next slide. As as the poem continues, she writes, "The sun itself finds nothing to love save soft rivulets of water its rays release from eons of hard frozen luck. But I tell you, I do love this blue-white giant and grieve its leaving, even as I thrill to watch thunderbolts of ice crash into azure seas." So we sit, you and I, scanning the newly revealed and imagining what next will show itself, what balded rock and bare shoreline as ice slips and pulls away in great chunks. We know it is leaving, abandoning us to what our kind has created, and we know its gift of rarefied water will only bring more sorrow. Yet it is a gorgeous deterioration, glowing face of one. Sorry, it's my view here is blocked right now. A glowing face of one turned inward, what the living cannot see. The expression of emotions comes through powerfully here, love and grief, such as we might feel in reaction to the vulnerability of a human being, and also the glacier's lack of control. What our kind has created. The glacier has not caused its disappearance. Our own kind, our humankind, has led to the planetary warming that is resulting in the diminishment of glaciers and the repetition of face, the idea of identifying with the face of the glacier. And here we see actually a human being looking at a diminishing glacier, literally the face of the glacier. So some of these strategies, discursive strategies that I mentioned earlier in my talk, are quite evident here in Holloman's poem. Next slide. Very different example of the vulnerability um, of non-humans represents the vulnerability of humans' closest animal relative, primates, in particular chimpanzees. And this is a book co-authored by the literary scholar Dale Peterson and Jane Goodall, the famous primatologist. And Peterson is actually Goodall's biographer, but they wrote a book together published in 1993 called Visions of Caliban on Chimpanzees and People. And much of the earlier parts of the book portray the characteristics of chimpanzees, showing how chimpanzees they may look somewhat like human beings, and they have certain human-like capacities of intelligence and social behavior, but they are also quite different. Um, they have an incredible strength. This passage, which I won't read, represents the extraordinary physical strength of chimpanzees, which is way beyond the strength of human beings. So whales are much larger than humans. Glaciers are enormous compared to human beings. Even chimpanzees, though they may not be physically large, are much, much stronger than humans. Next slide. However, chimpanzees are often abused by human beings. Their habitat is destroyed and they have no place to live in the wild. They are used as experimental animals in laboratories. And that's what Goodall is describing in this particular passage from late in the book, where she went in and toured a lab and was horrified at what she experienced there, and said even scientists who care a lot about animals, and are intelligent scientists, may fail to sense the meaning of their mistreatment of chimpanzees. And so she writes here the right-hand column here, what I've included, of meeting with the scientists after her tour. She emerged from the lab shocked and dazed, and then was sitting at a conference table with personnel, with scientists, trying to explain what she had experienced and the implications of this mistreatment of chimpanzees. She says, "I think you all know what I felt in there, in the lab. And since you're all decent, compassionate human beings, I assume you feel much the same. No one said anything." And then she went on to talk about wild chimpanzees, their close family lives, the long and carefree childhood, the excitements of social living, about the challenges that chimps must meet, their use of tools, their intelligence, their love of comfort, the rich variety of their diet. So she illuminates the actual richness of a true chimpanzee life in order to communicate with the scientists she's meeting with in this particular narrative, and with her reader, the vitality and the human likeness of these animals. And elsewhere in the book, I should have included a passage here. She writes about individual chimpanzees in a way a way of representing the singular examples as opposed to the chimpanzees in general. Next slide. And then she works toward later in the book, the idea of overcoming our sense of being ineffectual. This is the pseudo-inefficacy idea of the psychology of our response to information. If we could only somehow turn that habit around, that just me, it's just me, I can't do anything because I am just me, what Goodall calls just meism. We could have billions of people all acting in the best possible way toward environment and society. What a difference we would make. So what she's saying here late in the book is that the reason for portraying chimpanzees and bringing them to life in a way that we can identify with and care about is to break through the crust and rigidity of our sense of inefficacy and insensitivity to the plight of these non-human beings. And she argues that there are profound moral reasons to change our treatment of other species, as Goodall has done in many of her books and lectures. Next slide. Now I'm reaching the very end here, and I hope we'll have a few minutes at least to talk. I've spoken about whales, weasels, glaciers, and chimpanzees, but now I'd like to say a brief word about trees and climate change. And this is in the context of Rob Nixon's famous work of eco-criticism, Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, where he talks about this idea of slow violence, often violence, which leads to vulnerability of the natural environment, occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, and attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all because it's so slow. Nothing spectacular seems to be occurring through slow violence. It's exceedingly difficult for us to perceive such violence. Nixon calls this apprehension, the challenge of apprehension, to literally to grasp with our senses. That's one of the major problems with slow violence. And he says we need writer activists to help us apprehend threats imaginatively that remain imperceptible to the senses. And he says this is a different type of witnessing, not witnessing that we can do with our normal human senses, but witnessing with the imagination. And this is what this large field of environmental literature and art seeks to do, to witness imaginatively in such a way that we can apprehend vulnerable beings, environmental beings, that we can't literally see or feel or hear with our senses. Next slide. So I was just reading a recent article by Nixon called Fallen Martyrs, Felled Trees, in which he says we're experiencing an epidemic of environmental martyrdom, particularly in Earth's vital but embattled tropical forests. He refers to the fact that environmental activists, often indigenous people, are being literally murdered by forces set to work by industrial um, uh, industrial processes, corporations, governments that want to get rid of activists in order to harvest trees and animals and minerals from these parts of the world, are literally killing the activists who are trying to bring to light this environmental destruction. And the felling of trees, the logging of trees is often related to this environmental martyrdom. Next slide. And he refers to Arundhati Roy's 2019 publication, Walking with the Comrades, where she bears witness to the brutal contest for sovereignty, that is, control of the forests in the wooded areas of central India. I realize that I don't have much time left, but what Roy writes here is so powerful. I'd like to read at least part of it, where she says, "If there's any hope for the world at all, it lives low down on the ground with its arms around the people who go to battle every day to protect their forests, their mountains, and their rivers, because they know that the forests, the mountains, and the rivers protect them. The first step towards reimagining a world gone terribly wrong would be to stop the annihilation of those who have a different imagination, an imagination which has an altogether different understanding of what constitutes happiness and fulfillment." In this case, she's writing about indigenous communities and indigenous individuals who have a different worldview that enables them to appreciate the vital interdependence of human beings and the forests, mountains, rivers, and other elements of their physical habitat. A different imagination of this than westernized, modernized, industrialized communities might have. Next slide. And as I wrap up my talk, though, I'm in the very final slides here, I want to talk about another type of protection of forests and identification with an individual element within the forests, represented by Julia Butterfly Hill's well-known book from the year 2000 called The Legacy of Luna, which is the story of how Hill, who's an environmental activist, actually she climbed up to the top of a redwood tree in Northern California, and she stayed in the tree for more than 2 years, December 10th, 1997 to December 18th, 1999, to prevent, I should say prevent, not present, loggers from cutting down the tree and the nearby forest. By making herself a martyr or a potential martyr, by climbing the tree, and if the loggers had cut it down, she would have been killed as well as the tree being killed. This potential martyrdom prevented the loggers from logging this tree and other trees near it. She starts the book by writing about the enormous size of these redwood trees. They're utterly inhuman in their scale. But then later, she describes the tree with a sense of intimacy, almost human-like personification. Next slide. She discusses the fact that shortly after she climbed the tree, she realized that she could not stay on the tree very well if she wore shoes. So she took off her shoes most of these 2 years that she spent near the top of this tree. You can see her up here in the tree canopy. She wore no shoes. And with her bare feet, not only could she grip the branches more securely, but she could feel Luna's life force and take instruction from the tree called Luna about how to climb. So literally, she's communicating through her feet with the tree, establishing an intimate physical and emotional relationship during this 2-year period of activism and martyrdom. Next slide. This is, I think, my last slide. Oh, or I want maybe one more after this. What I've tried to suggest in my various examples here is, again, that writers use strategies that display an intuitive understanding of what psychologists and eco-critics like me refer to as the arithmetic of compassion. Again, the power of singularity, even when representing the large or the collective, the importance of enabling readers or viewers to identify with the victim, sometimes through anthropomorphic techniques, the representation of the victim's innocence, lack of control over the situation resulting in harm, and also the sense that extreme destruction, death or mortality or extinction are at risk through this vulnerability. Next slide, final slide. And again, back to Donovan. Donovan's interview, which I encourage you to look at in order to see the way a writer actually thinks about all of this, is a particularly acute or insightful explanation of the process of feeling and articulating trans-species empathy toward vulnerable non-human beings, what could be called ecological empathy. And a lot of it involves stepping back, as Donovan puts it, stepping back so that someone else can emerge, allowing us in a way to put to the side our own specific sensibilities in order to put ourselves in the situations and in the minds of non-human phenomena. And this is perhaps what it takes in order for us to have the capacity to appreciate environmental vulnerability. Thank you very much for your attention and for your interest in this topic, and I hope we have at least a few minutes for some conversation.
Thank you, Professor Slovic, for that talk, which took us through a wide array of texts, including statistics, numbers, images, a very multimodal array, really, all the while pointing us towards how an interpretative practice such as this could bring in compassion and empathy to understand planetary vulnerabilities, fragilities. Yes, we will be opening up the talk to questions now. Yes, Roy, you can just unmute yourself and ask the question.
Thank you so much, sir, for the enlightening session. Your talk reminded me of a particular passage that I had come across that tries to exhibit the cruelties of whale hunting. But what differentiates this passage from others is that it does not go into the factual details. It does not try to explain what a harpoon is or things like that. What it does is it asks the reader to visualize a horse that is being chased through the city streets, being continuously bombarded with bombarded with spears and being shot at. And it tries to show how visceral and gradual the death is, how painful it is, and it tries to put the spectacle in a much more relatable environment. So instead of maybe depending on facts, and the facts as they are terrifying, I mean I agree, but instead of depending on facts, it encourages the reader to use the imagination. And as someone who's not at all familiar with the ocean, I could relate to the violence involved in such an act by reading such a passage. So I could relate to that passage when I heard you talk. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good example. And this idea of relatability is connected to what I meant when I talked about identification. We can actually feel connected to the example that's being presented to us, even if we know little about the ocean, little about whales, little about glaciers, little about redwood trees. Making the information relatable so that we can feel a personal connection is very important. What you're describing about using horses as almost a metaphor for whales is a really interesting example. It's almost like looking at the primary topic of whales indirectly in order to imagine what readers will be able to appreciate and feel attached to. Thank you for that good example.
Sutirthu Roy, do you want to go next?
Yes, thank you. Sir, thank you for the amazing lecture. I agree with you about how the bias against anthropomorphism is often unwarranted and it becomes a really viable tool for envisioning empathy with the non-human other. I was wondering, however, and this is something I've grappled with during my own research, to what extent can we anthropomorphize? Because several creatures like bats experience the world through different senses, like echolocation, and the very notion of the individual is lacking in case of hive minds or clusters like polyps or fungi. My question is, as I was wondering how we can strike a balance between sustainable anthropomorphism that does not ontologically erase the difference of the non-human animal while balancing it with a form of projection that overcomes psychic dumbing or the anesthesia of destruction. And like as a follow-up, would narrativizing the state of mind of the animal and its reaction to ecological dilemmas need scientific or biological knowledge about a particular species, ecosystem, tangible real-world threats, or relationship with humans, and so on the part of the creative writer?
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, that's really what I was attempting to say, but I think you said it very articulately. When I was describing Donovan's use of the multidimensional approaches, including the cetological information and discussing whale biology and various other topics, as well as the fictionalized passages, such as the one that I presented to you, where she's speculating about what a whale might be experiencing. So I think to narrativize the writer's own process of learning about the science of the other species. Bats is a great example, of course, because of the famous philosophical essay, what is it like to be a bat? We can never, as humans, really know what it's like to be a bat, but we can study bats and we can learn certain things about a bat's physiology, even if we cannot truly be in the mind of a bat. And so by narrativizing the process of learning about these non-human phenomena and telling that story of our own experience of learning about this species, we in a way we're saying we are not bats, but we might attempt to leap imaginatively into the perspective of a bat. And when I refer to those passages in Donovan's essay where she's saying, perhaps this is what the young whale experienced, I cannot know for sure, but I'm imagining or speculating. So she's attempting to kind of keep herself at a distance rather than being overly presumptuous about her ability to place herself in this other organism's perspective. And yet at the same time, she is urging us to take a leap of the imagination in order to be sensitive to the vulnerability of that other creature. So it's a very delicate balance. And I think personification and anthropomorphism can be abused, but they can also be used very delicately and effectively in order to help us to appreciate these kinds of vulnerabilities that I think we really must appreciate in order to be more mindful of the impacts of human behavior on the planet. Yeah, thank you very much for that well-stated question.
Would Susan Harris like to go next?
Yeah. Hi. Thanks for the talk. I just had two questions. One is, I sometimes suspect that when it comes to literary writing about non-humans specifically, that it's not possible to see them as moral agents, but that they always cast as victims and maybe as moral patients and not really as creatures with equal agency. So I wanted to know what you think of that. And when you were talking about empathy and about self-erasure, I was thinking about animal rights activists especially, and I suppose part of it is strategic, but they can't really afford to do self-erasure. So I wanted to know if you think the mode of empathy in environmental writing is different from the mode of empathy that activists have to practice. Thanks.
Well, first of all, the idea of the moral agency of non-human characters in environmental literature. I mean, this issue of agency is, a key topic of discussion by specialists in animal literature, and I think particularly of the book on what is the title offhand? The South African writer who writes about subjectivity. What?
Is it J.M. Coetzee's The
No,
Life?
not Coetzee. Not Coetzee. It's a woman colleague of mine. I know her work very well, but it's on viewing subjectivity in Southern African fiction, and the idea of animals, animal subjectivity, and the idea that the problem is that we're always looking at animals, not respecting animals looking at us, and having a type of agency. And she attempts to kind of turn the tables and discuss fiction in which animals actually do have various forms of moral agency. They're not merely passive canvases upon which humans write our desires and abuses. And so there is actually a primary literature of animals becoming more active agents, and an effort to suggest that we should not merely think of the non-human as being passive. And anyway, I guess all I can say right now is that this is a serious concern, and it's a danger of what I was discussing earlier. And yet also, by representing the victims of human action not being culpable themselves for these actions, it happens to be particularly evocative for audiences, a sense of indignation that these beings should be subjected to forces over which they do not necessarily have control. And the idea of self-erasure or almost disempowerment on the part of environmental activists, that's a fascinating idea, because obviously the activist must have a certain type of empowerment in order to try to engage with a problem and overcome it. And so I think if I had had more time to elaborate on visions of Caliban, I might have suggested that both Dale Peterson and Jane Goodall, who are primate activists, are in a sense not erasing themselves in the way that some other writers do, Dillard and other people, as they're attempting to implant themselves in the minds of these beings that they're representing. But Goodall, I think, does actually, although she may empathize, she maintains her own solid identity in the narrative in order to have her very strong statement at the end of the book, Visions of Caliban, which I presented to you, about the just meism. She says, I have this idea, I have this phrase, just meism, and it's a problem because we all say, it's just me, it's only me, I can't do anything, and yet we must overcome that if we're to engage with the serious environmental and societal problems we face in the world. And so in order to assert herself, she does not erase herself, but she actually stands solidly and waves her fist, in a way, her literary fist, and says, we must act, we must overcome this, we must stop this mistreatment. So I think you're right. Self-erasure is not effective when the goal is a type of activism, but it may be effective if the goal is simply to help readers take a leap of imagination and somehow mentally experience the conditions of vulnerable beings that are being represented in cultural texts.
Can we have T. Ravichandran next?
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Professor Scott, for such a very illuminating talk. And it's really indeed an eye-opener in many ways to many of us. I have two clarifications. The first one, on the one hand, I was very happy the way you presented your talk. The examples, the illustrations are both from the global north as well as from the global south. Okay, so I find it a kind of cosmic view, giving a planetary connection to narratives from both sides. But was that intentional, or is it's something that you think is it a kind of vision, or do you think in practice it's really happening? Aren't there real differences between the global north and the global south, especially in terms of environmental injustice? Okay. And the second one is how far one can be really eco-empathetic. Now, for one can really come out of this anthropocentric attitude, perspective, standpoint. The question is like, can we be really empathetic to creatures which are invisible, which are not the materialistic mass like whale or something, which are something like, for example, the COVID-19 virus, and something that doesn't harm us, something that is vulnerable, we could be more empathetic. But if something that is harmful to mankind, would we be able to emote the same kind of empathy and take the virus point of view? These are my doubts.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, I think one could be even more planetarily inclusive than I was in my talk. I used a lot of North American examples, although I would say Rob Nixon's book about slow violence uses global examples. And when he is interested in the effects of global capitalism, neoliberalism, he calls it, around the world, he is certainly trying to be globally inclusive, mostly of the global South. I would say that it's an open question whether different literary strategies, communication strategies, are used by writers and artists who actually come from the global South than by people in the global North. I'm thinking, for instance, of Ishimori Michiko, who comes from southern Japan and writes famously about Minamata disease in southern Japan. Japan, obviously, in some ways is the global North, but the rural regions and the outlying regions away from Tokyo are often represented as the global South, developing areas that are victimized by certain types of industrial processes. And Ishimori, who began writing in the 1960s and early 70s about the effects of chemical contamination from photographic processing plants on Minamata Bay and subsequently on the people who ate fish from the bay, it has produced some famous examples of writing about both simultaneously environmental vulnerability and human vulnerability. And she uses, I guess, her approach, which might be a global Southern approach, is to emphasize vernacular, highly localized experiences, vernacular cultural situations, vernacular dialect. It's her book, Paradise in the Sea of Sorrow, which was published in Japanese, is written in a special type of Minamata Ben, local dialect, which may be a strategy particularly used in the global South, rather than a more global Northern approach, which would be to use standard language, kind of mainstream English prose or Japanese language rather than localized dialect. But eco-empathetic, I guess one of the takeaways of my talk is that it's very difficult for us to be empathetic with the planet in general, with ecology as a global biospheric system. Empathy is highly particularized. It's the way the human mind works, and that we need to understand that although there may be flaws and breaches of factuality in the way certain writers represent the conditions of vulnerable non-human beings, or what they're trying to do is communicate to human beings. The audiences of literature are human. So the task of the writer is to try to be technically accurate and at the same time meaningful, to use discourse that is meaningful to a human audience. So in doing so, there may have to be certain compromises. You may have to play around a little bit with factuality in order to produce a kind of language that is effective for your anticipated audience. And then as far as the representation goes of invisible creatures or creatures that we may find disturbing or potentially harmful, this is also the sort of thing that eco-critics have often studied in the context of animal literature. Not only eco-critics, but artists. And there's, for instance, a well-known essay by the American author David Quammen called The Face of a Spider, in which he writes specifically about what it would take in order for us to attempt to grasp the epistemology of a spider, the way a spider experiences the world. And I mean, it's an almost unanswerable question. What is the appropriate way to convey this information? We see writers and artists experimenting, energetically with their media in order to find effective ways of representing various phenomena. There is, I wish I had the title offhand, but there's a novel published, I believe, in mainland China about viruses, which attempts to do what you're suggesting, actually to write about a pandemic from the perspective of a virus. I mean, if you reach out to me, I can do a little bit of research and try to find the title of that novel. But people have thought of that possibility and wondered what it might be actually to take a non-human perspective on a phenomenon like that. But yes, I in some ways, I think the examples that I used are low-hanging fruit. I use mammals like chimpanzees and whales, and yet a glacier. How to convey the vulnerability of a glacier? I like that poem by Mary Beth Holloman very much, because a glacier is the sort of thing that you would think is enormous and powerful. How might you ever represent that to a human reader so that the human would sympathize with the glacier? It's just water. It's a large mass of water, and yes, it may be very, very slowly dissipating because of the changing climate. And the fact that Holloman writes about it so movingly, while still representing its behavior, the way it grinds its way toward the sea, and the way it moves not toward death, but toward oblivion. In very subtle ways, she's representing it accurately, an utterly non-human phenomenon, which is indicative, of course, of a much larger scale planetary phenomenon of global warming. But it's embodied in the glacier, and it's captured in the poem in a way that might be viscerally meaningful for humans, because she, as the speaker, and she writes it in the first person, as a speaker attempting to convey her yearning. What would it be like to hold the glacier in one's arms and wrap it in a blanket? An utter impossibility, but something that a poet can do imaginatively, and that we can do imaginatively as readers of such a poem. I think we might imagine what an artist would do with some of these other phenomena that you're describing that are microscopic or that are potentially unpleasant for humans. And there is certainly a literature that attempts to represent these phenomena that I just didn't contain in my particular lecture. Yeah, so thank you for raising these issues.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So good evening,
Dr. Vijay.
Thank you for the wonderful lecture, sir. I am Vijayarani from Tamil Nadu, India. So thank you for introducing the websites and lots of books on eco-consciousness, making us to raise our eyebrows, making us to ponder over the environmental hazards in the perspective of whales, perspective of glaciers, all that. I am being touched by the point, a 4-year-old whale bearing the memory of the mother whale. It's very poignant and touching, and we understand we have to protect nature. And Greta Thunberg's loud cry, I have sent my comments earlier. Greta Thunberg, loud cry was not heard, and all the narratives, all the wonderful books that you have introduced us, though it stops in the narration level itself. The action plans are not taken by the governments to the implementation part of it, and there we become a failure, and that's why COP26 became a failure, great failure. And so it is, thank you very much for educating us on this. Provided action plans are necessary. And when you talk about glaciers, the world's major glaciers are melting. The Doomsday Glaciers, Pine Island glaciers, and the world's major glaciers are melting very fast and becomes a threat to our life itself. And it's a wonderful lecture, sir. Thank you for educating us.
Thank you very much for your comments. Yeah, thanks to all of you for attending this lecture. Yeah.
Miss Vaidehi, you can ask your question now.
Thank you, sir, for this opportunity of being able to listen to your lecture. Since this lecture was majorly about empathizing with non-human entities and their vulnerability and listening to their voices, I remember coming across the term sentience, which means that non-human entities do have human features like feeling and communicating through their own signs. So I'm just eager to know if you have any instances in fiction for the quality of sentience in non-human entities and its relevance with empathizing with their vulnerability.
Thank you for raising the issue of sentience. And in partly, you know, what I've been talking about in the examples that I did use in my lecture were that we might have the potential through literature to empathize even with phenomena that we know do not have anything like human sentience. It's one thing to talk about mammals, like a primate, a chimpanzee, or a gorilla may have a form of sentience that is somewhat comparable to human beings. Even whales, who are fellow mammals, may have a recognizable form of human-like sentience. But to empathize with a glacier and to appreciate the possibility that a glacier has a certain type of quote-unquote awareness of its own vulnerability to oblivion, and the process, the idea that it is moving toward oblivion, implies that a phenomenon that is inorganic, technically a glacier is not alive like a mammal or so many other organisms, and yet does it have a certain type of go back to the earlier word that we were using, agency, and maybe a moral agency, that maybe the glacier has a right to exist even if it doesn't have anything like organic sentience. So a glacier would be a good example of that. Within the field of ecological literary studies, there has been a strong interest in the past decade or so in our material relationship to the world, drawing on ideas from new materialist philosophy. We refer to this branch of eco-criticism as material eco-criticism. And one of the contributions of material eco-criticism is that it finds the possibility of story in all material phenomena. The idea that a rock or a stream of water or a table has material agency, what the theorist Jane Bennett calls agentic capacity. It has a certain form of agency that is akin to sentience. It's not sentience in the human-like form where there's a brain processing information and emotion, but it is a form of agency can be attributed to all material phenomena. And to me, the topic of agency, the idea of agency and the idea of sentience converge in a certain way, and we can maybe speculate that the agency of a non-sentient material being, such as a stone, is somewhat akin to our own consciousness. So I would encourage you to look at the field of material eco-criticism, particularly at a book called simply Material Eco-Criticism, published in 2014, for discussion of kind of agency and sentience and story and the way these ideas intertwine. So I'm struggling to remember the name of the book that I was talking about from South Africa. I think it's called Animal Subjectivity in Southern African Fiction, which pushes back against the idea of the animal as victim and actually emphasizes a variety of animal narratives in which their consciousness and their subjectivity is highlighted, because it is a concern that animals are often viewed as being passive, or the non-human world is passive, and humans are the only active moral agents in the world. So I wonder if we can take just another question or two. Actually, I join a group of friends to run every morning, and I need to leave in 5 or 10 minutes to go join my group. It's about 6:55 in the morning here right now, so I should try to head out the door fairly soon. Any other? Yeah.
Actually, no, we are winding up too. So I would like to propose a formal vote of thanks to Scott for his immediate yes to my email, whether he would give us this talk, despite pointing out the time zone difference. So the generosity is really something special for us. So thank you, Scott. Thanks to several colleagues and friends and students who joined. We hit upwards of 150 at one point, I was told, by those monitoring this conversation. I'm also particularly delighted to see the number of queries and comments that have come in, and your extraordinary patience, Scott, in answering all this. So this is a great start for us on the subject of environmental vulnerability. And we will look forward to having extended conversations at some point in the future of the chair's tenure. So thank you one and all, and have a good day, Scott. Have a good run, having done your bit for us. And thanks to everyone, and good night for those in India. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.